Hey guys, it's Sunday reading day, and I'll be reading from the book 25 Ghost Stories, written by various authors. I'll be right back. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a great weekend. I know I have. In fact, as we speak, this is a pre-recorded show. I recorded it Friday evening. But as we speak and as I'm doing this, we are doing a prelim for investigation for a young family here in Sacramento. So that's why I had to pre-record this. But I'm glad to be here. I love reading this book, as you know. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. Let me get this queued up. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state, which means if you think you have a paranormal situation going on, we can get you. It might take us a couple days. California is a big state. So, yeah, it might take us a couple days. But in the case that it does take us a couple days, my squeaky chair out again. In the case that it does take us a couple days, we do have mediums and psychics on staff, or psychic mediums, I'll say it that way, on staff who can help you by doing a remote read. They'll call you and talk with you. And if it is something paranormal, then in most cases they can calm the energy down and calm whatever's going on down until we get out there. Okay? It gives us time to get out to wherever your location is. So that's one of the pluses. If you need to find us, we are all over the web. Just Google California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team or Google California Haunts Radio. You will find us everywhere. Now, that being said, for those of you that are watching and listening tonight on Facebook, if you haven't done so already and you like what you see and hear today, please feel free to hit that follow button. We're always looking for followers. Also, give me a thumbs up. Show me a happy face and these heart things that I could never do with my hands. And chat in the chat room. I mean, just because I'm not here doesn't mean you can't chat amongst yourselves in the chat room. So feel free to do that. Same thing with YouTube. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. We've got over 900 videos sitting over there. And they're all of this show. And I'm a journalist, photojournalist, so I like to do different topics. So you're not going to get the same topics every day. We do broadcast Sunday through Friday. Okay. So, what happens when you subscribe and do all that good stuff? Well, this is what happens, especially when you put the happy hearts up and all that to show me some love. Well, what that does is it puts us up higher in the FYP. It works that way for all the internet social media places, whether it's Twitch, Facebook, YouTube. The main computer at those places see it, see you doing that stuff on these on this stuff, and it automatically will put us out to more people. See, that's the idea, is we want to be seen by more people. So the more stuff like that you do, the more people you see. As you can see, speaking of which, there's a ticker running along the bottom. That's because, like I said, we're on a prelim this afternoon. But we did do an equipment check, and there's some equipment that we're lacking in, and some of our equipment's kind of old and outdated, and it needs work. So we've got a $100 goal going there, because we are a nonprofit. There's a $100 goal going on there to fix up our equipment and maybe get some new equipment. So if you can help us out with that, that would be great. Yeah, it's not a requirement. You don't have to, but it would be great if you could do that. Also, Thursday, don't forget, 9:30 p.m. or 9:30 a.m. Pacific, or 9 a.m. Pacific. Thursday morning. Coffee. I'm tired today. Coffee. It's coffee with a Ghosthunter. You can pick my brain, ask me anything. I've been doing this for 18 years, and if I don't have the answer, I will find it for you. Okay, and then I will get back to you. All right, let's get to reading this book, 25 Ghost Stories. Hopefully, we're not going to run out of stories because we've been getting through them pretty fast. But today we're going to read. I'm going to read for about an hour. I'm going to be on the air for about an hour, and then I'm going to let you guys go. All right, this is something, maybe it's you're sitting around eating dinner, or you're hanging out with your fuzzies on and sitting on the couch in the dark and having hot cocoa or whatever it is you do on a Sunday evening. This is it, man. This is your chance to hear ghost stories before you go to sleep. So let's get on with that, and let's have some fun, you guys. Let's have some fun. I'm just double checking my time. Want to make sure I stay at the hour mark. Okay. And that would put me at... Okay. All right, here we go. So I already have it open. So let's get to reading it. We have a little sip of water here. To give you an idea what time it is right now. It's 12:30. It's 12:23 a.m. where I'm at right now. So like I said, I'm doing this ahead of time. Okay, this story. Now, some of these are true ghost stories. Some of these aren't. There's no clarification of what might be true and what's not. So just as an FYI, this is for you to decide. Did these stories actually happen? Did they not actually happen? Well, that's, like I said, that's for you guys to decide. All right, here we go. The next story is Grand Dame's Ghost Story. And it's written by CD, whoever CD is. So here we go. I don't know whether you ever tell your children ghost stories or not. Some mothers don't, but our mother, though of German descent, was strong-minded on the ghost subject and early taught all of her children to be fearless mentally as well as physically. And though dearly fond of hearing ghost stories, especially if they were real, true ghost stories, we were sadly skeptical as to there being anything of the kind that could harm. We were quite learned in ghostly lore, knew all about doppelgangers, he calls it doppelgangers, will-o'-the-wisp, blue lights, etc., and we could not have a greater treat for good behavior than our mother to draw on her store of supernatural tales for our entertainment. The story I'm about to relate, she told us one stormy night when, gathered round her chair in her cozy sanctum, before a cheerful fire, we ate nuts and apples and listened while she recited our true story, told her by her grandmother, who herself witnessed the vision. Get over here a little bit, okay? Okay. Sorry for the creak. I still have to get over and get some WD-40, so I apologize for that. It was a fearful night. The wind sobbed and wailed round the house like lost spirits, mourning their doom. The rain beat upon the casements, and the trees, writhing in the torture of the fierce blast, groaned and swayed until their tops almost swept the earth. Bright flashes of lightning pierced even through the closed shutters and heavy curtains, and thunder had a sullen, threatening roar that made your blood creep. It was a night to make one seek to shut out all sound, draw the curtains close, stir the fire, and nestle deep in the armchair before it, with feet upon the fender, excuse me, and have something cheerful to think or talk about. But I was all alone. None in the house with me but the servants, and the servants' wing was detached from the main part of the building, for I did not care to have menials near me, and I had no loved ones near. Remember, these books were written anywhere from the mid to late 1800s all the way up to 1946, so there's going to be stuff in here that may not jive with our beliefs today. It was such a night that Nancy Black died. What a fearful night for the soul to leave its earthly home and go out into the vast unknown future. I spoke aloud as, rousing from a train of thought, I drew my heavy mantle closer round me, wheeled my armchair near the fire, and cuddled down in it, burying my feet in the foot cushion to warm them, for I felt strangely cold. I was in the library. It was my usual sitting room, for I seldom use the parlors. What was the use? My books were my friends, and I loved best to be with them. My children dead, or married and away, the cold grand parlors always seemed gloomy and sad. The ghosts of departed pleasures haunted them, and I cared not to enter them. It was a long, wide room across the hall from the parlors, running the whole length of the house, and was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. My husband's father had been a diplomatic, and my husband had had a leaning that way also. And the shelves held many an old rare work that was worth its weight in gold. I'm sorry, bibliomatic. That's my bibliomatic. It's going to be like that. The fire, though burning brightly, did not illume one half of the room, of which, sitting in the chimney corner, I commanded, is it tonight? I commanded a full view, and had been looking at the shadows playing on the furniture and shelves, as the flame shot up, and after flickering a moment, would die out, leaving a gloom which would break away into fantastic shadows as the firelight would again shoot up. While watching the gleams of light and darkling shades, unconsciously, the wailing of the storm outside attracted my attention. There seemed to be odd noises of tapping on the windows, and sobs and sighs, as though someone was entreating entrance from the fierce tumult. And as I sat there, again I thought of Nancy Black, the old schoolgirl friend who had loved me so dearly, and the night when she went forth to meet the doom appointed her. Resting my head upon my hand, I sat gazing in the fire, thinking over her strange life and still stranger death, and wondering what could have become of the money and jewels that I knew she had once possessed. While sitting thus, a queer sensation crept over me. It was not fear, but a feeling as though if I'd look up, I'd see something frightful. A shiver, not like that of cold, ran from my head to my feet, and a sensation as though someone was breathing icy cold breath upon my forehead. The same feeling you would cause by holding a piece of ice to your cheek. It fluttered over my face and finally settled around my lips, as though the unseen one was caressing me, thrilling me with horror. But I am not fearful, nervous or imaginative, and resolutely throwing off the dread that fell upon me. I turned round and I looked up, and there, so close by my side that my hand, involuntarily thrown out, passed through her seeming form, stood Nancy Black. It was Nancy Black, and yet not Nancy Black. Her whole body had a semi-transparent appearance, just as your hand looks when you hold it between yourself and a strong light. Her clothing, apparently the same as worn in life, had a wavy, seething, flickering look, like flames have, and yet did not seem to burn. "In the name of God, Nancy Black, what brought you here, and whence came you?" I exclaimed. A hollow whisper followed. "Thank you, my old friend, for speaking to me, and oh, how deeply I thank you for thinking of me tonight. I shall have rest." "Rest," I heard echoed, and a jeering laugh rang through the room that made her quiver at its sound. "I have been near you often, but always failed to find you in a condition when you would be in rapport before tonight. What I came for I will tell you. Whence I come, you need not know. Suffice it to say that were I happy, I would not be here on such an errand, nor on such a night. It is only when the elements are in a tumult, and the winds wail and moan, that we come forth. When you hear these sounds, it is souls of the lost you hear mourning their doom. 'Tis then they wander up and down, to and fro, their only release from their fearful home of torture and undying pain. I have come to tell you that you must go over to the old house, and in the back room I always kept locked. Have the carpet taken up from toward the fireplace. You will see a plank with a knothole in it. Remove that, and you will find what caused me to lose my soul. Have prayers said to me, for 'tis well to pray for the dead. The money and jewels give in charity. Bury in holy ground the others you find, and pray for them and me. Ah, Jeanette, you thought your old friend, though strange and odd, pure and innocent. It's a bitter part of my punishment that I must change your thought of me. Farewell. Do not fail me, and I shall trouble you no more. But whenever you hear that wind howl and sweep round the house, as it does tonight, know that the lost are near. It is their swift flight through space, fleeing before the scourge of memory and conscience, that causes the sound. That tomorrow you may not think you are dreaming, here is a token." And she touched the palm of my hand with her fingertips, and as you see, my child, to this day, there are 3 crimson spots in the palm of my hand that nothing will eradicate. Do not fail me, and pray for us, Jeanette. Pray. And with a longing, wistful gaze and a deep sobbing sigh, Nancy Black faded from my sight. Am I dreaming? I exclaimed, as I rose from my chair and rang the bell. When the servant entered, I bade him attend to the fire and light the lamps, and I went through the room to see if any unusual arrangement of the furniture could have caused the appearance. But nothing was apparent, and I bade him send me my maid to attend me in my chamber, for I could not help feeling unwilling to remain in the library any longer that evening. While making my toilet for the night, my maid said, "Have you burned your hand, madam?" Glancing hastily down, I saw 3 dark crimson spots upon the palm of my left hand. They had an odd look, seared as though touched by a red-hot iron. Yet the flesh was soft, not burned and not painful. Making some excuse for it, I did not allude to it again, and dismissed her speedily, that I might reflect, undisturbed, over the singular occurrence. There were the marks upon my hand. I could not remove them, and they did not fade. In fact, their deep red made the rest of the palm lose its pinkish hue and look pale from the strong contrast. Could I have been asleep and dreamed it all? And by any means have done this to myself? I thought, but finally concluded that on the morrow I go over to Nancy Black's old residence and settle the question, and with that conclusion had to content myself until the morrow came. Nancy Black was an old friend from my girlhood who had owned large property in the town and lived all alone in a spacious stone house directly opposite my home, and who, when dying, had left me the sole legatee of her property. When morning came, I took the keys, and with my mind went over to Nancy's house. It had never been disturbed since her death, which was sudden and somewhat singular, and the furniture remained just as she left it, when taken for her last resting place. We went to the room Nancy had directed. I bade Sarah take up the carpet, and sure enough, there was a plank with a knothole in it. So I sent her from the room, and lifted the plank myself, and there, between the 2 joints, rested a long box, the lid not fastened. Opening it, I was horrified to see 2 skeletons, those of an infant and of a woman, small in stature and delicate frame. In a moment it flashed before me that I saw all that remained of Nancy Black's young sister, a girl of 17, who had left home somewhat mysteriously years ago, and had died while absent. At least, that was the version Nancy had given of her absence, and no one had dreamed of doubting it. Her tale was so naturally told. Left orphans when Lucy was only 2 years and Nancy 18. She had devoted her life to the care of this young girl, and when she found her sister had fallen, she, in her pride of name and position, had destroyed mother and child, that her shame might not be known, and had lived all those dreary years in that house with her fearful secret. Round the box, heaped up on every side, were money and jewels, and a parchment scroll among them had written on it, "Lucy's share of our father's estate." I carried out Nancy's wishes to the letter, for I now firmly believed that she had come to me herself that night. To avoid scandal resting on the dead, I took our clergyman into my confidence, and with his assistance had the remains buried quietly in consecrated ground. The money and jewels were given to the poor, and the old building I turned into a home for destitute females, and morning and night, as I kneeled in prayer, I prayed for the forgiveness to rest upon Nancy Black and peace to her troubled soul. Okay. The next one is A Fight with a Ghost by Q.E.D. "No, I never believed much in ghosts," said the doctor, "but I was always rather afraid of them." "Have you ever seen one?" asked one of the other men. The doctor took a cigar out of his mouth and contemplated the ash for a moment or two before replying. "I have had some rather startling experiences," he said, after a pause, during which the rest of us exchanged glances, for the doctor has seen many things, and is not adverse to talking about them in congenial company. "Would you care about hearing one of them? It gives me the cold shivers, now to speak of it." We nodded, and the doctor, taking a sip as an antidote to the shivers, began. "You remember George Carson, who played for the varsity some years ago? Big chap. with a light mustache? Well, I saw a good deal of him before he married. Well, he was reading for the bar in town. It was just after he became engaged to Miss Stoner, who is now Mrs. Carson, that he asked me to go down to a place which his people had taken in the country. Miss Stoner was to be left there, and he wanted me to meet her. I could not go for the Christmas day. I could not go down for the Christmas day, as I had promised to be with my people. But as I had been working a bit too hard and wanted a few days' rest, I decided to run down for a few days about the time of New Year. Woodcote was a pleasant enough place to look at. There were 2 packs of hounds within each distance, and it was not far enough from a station to cut you off completely from the morning papers. The Carsons had been lucky, I thought, in coming across such a good house at such a moderate figure. For, as George told me, the owner had been obliged to go abroad for his health, and was anxious not to leave the place empty all the winter. It was an old house, with big gables and preposterous corners all over the place, and you couldn't walk 10 paces along any of the passages without tumbling up or downstairs. But it had been patched from time to time, and, among other improvements, a big billiard room had been built out at the back. A country house in the winter without a billiard room, when the frost stops hunting, is just, well, not even a gilded prison. The party was a small one. Besides George and his father and mother, there were only a couple of Mrs. Carson, who, being somewhere in the early teens, didn't count, and Miss Stoner, who, of course, counted a good deal, and lastly, myself. Miss Stoner ought to have been happy, for George Carson, besides being an excellent fellow all around, was by no means a bad match, being an only son with considerable expectations. But somehow or other, she did not strike me as looking either very well or very happy. She gave me the impression of having something on her mind, which made her alternately nervous and listless. George, I fancied, noticed it, and was puzzled by it, for I caught him several times watching her, with an anxious and inquiring look. But as I was not there as a doctor, of course it was no business of mine, though I discovered the reason before I left Woodcote. The second night after my arrival, we had been playing, I remember, a family pool. The rest had gone upstairs to bed. George and I adjourned to a sort of study, which he had arranged upstairs, for a final smoke and a chat before turning in. The study was next to his bedroom, and parted off from it by curtains. As we were settling down, I missed my pipe, and remembered that I had laid it down in the billiard room. On principle, I never smoke another man's pipe, so I lit a candle, the house being in darkness, and started away in search of my own. The house looked awfully weird by the flickering light of a solitary candle, and the stairs creaked in a particularly gruesome way behind me, just for all the world as though someone were following at my heels. I found my pipe where I had expected in the billiard room, and came back in perhaps a little more hurry than was absolutely necessary, which, perhaps, explains why I stumbled in the uncertain light over a couple of unforeseen stairs, and dropped my candle. Of course it went out, but after a little groping I found it. Having no matches with me, I was obliged to feel my way along the banisters, for it was so dark that I could not see my hand in front of me. And as I slowly advanced, sliding my hand along the broad balustrade at my side, it suddenly slid over something cold and clammy, which was not balustrade at all. For, stopping dead and closing my fingers round it for an instant, I felt that I was holding another hand, a skinny, bony hand, which had raised itself slowly from my grasp. And though I could hear nothing and see nothing, I was yet conscious that something was brushing past me and going up the stairs. "Hi, what's that? Who are you?" I called. There was no answer. I admit that I was in a regular funk. I must have shown it in my face. "What's the matter?" asked George, as I blundered into his study. "Oh, nothing," I answered, dropping my candle and lost the way. I dropped my candle and lost my way. "But who were you talking to?" "I was only swearing at the candle," I replied. "Oh, I thought perhaps you had seen Somebody, replied George. Somehow, I did not like to tell him the truth, for fear he would laugh at my nervousness. But I determined to keep an eye on my liver and take a couple of weeks' complete rest. That night, I woke up several times with the feeling of that confounded hand under my own, a clammy hand which writhed as my fingers closed upon it. The next morning after breakfast, I was in that billiard room practicing strokes while Carson was over at the stables. Presently the door opened, and Miss Stoner looked in. Come in, I said. George will be back from the stables in a few minutes. Meanwhile, we can have a 50 up. I wanted to speak to you, she said. She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have an uninterrupted holiday after all. Do you believe in ghosts? She asked, having closed the door and come up to the table where she stood leaning with both her hands upon it. No, I replied, missing an easy carom as I remembered my experience of last night. But I believe in fancy. And supposing then that a person fancies he saw things, is there any remedy? What do you mean, Miss Stoner? I replied, looking at her in some surprise. Do you mean that you fancy... I stopped, for Miss Stoner turned away, sat down on one of the easy chairs by the wall, and burst into tears. Oh, please help me, she sobbed. I believe I'm going mad. I laid down my cue and went over to her. Look here, Miss Stoner, I said, taking her hand, which was hot and feverish. I'm a doctor and a friend of George. Now tell me all about it, and I'll do my best to set it right. She was in a more or less hysterical condition, and her words were freely punctuated by sobs. But gradually I managed to elicit from her that nearly every night since she came to Woodcote she had been awakened in some mysterious way, and had seen a horrible face looking at her from over the top of a screen which stood by the door of her bedroom. As soon as she moved, the face disappeared, which convinced her that the apparition existed only in her imagination. That seemed to distress her even more than if she had believed it to be a genuine ghost, for she thought her brain was giving way. I told her that she was only suffering from a very common symptom of nervous disorder, as indeed it was, and promised to send a groom into the village to get a prescription made up for her. And, having made me promise to breathe no word to anyone on the subject, more especially to George, she went away relieved. Nevertheless, I was not quite certain that I had made a correct diagnosis of the case. You see, I had been rather upset myself not many hours before. George was longer than I expected at the stable, and I was just going to find him when at the door I met Mrs. Carson. Can you spare me one moment? She said, as I held open the door for her. I wanted to find you alone. Certainly, Mrs. Carson, with pleasure. An hour, if you wish, I replied. It is so convenient, you know, to have a doctor in the house, she said, with a nervous laugh. Now I want you to prescribe me a sleeping draught. My nerves are rather out of order, and I don't sleep as I should. Ah, I said, do you see faces and such like things when you're awake? How do you know? She asked quickly. Oh, I inferred from the other symptoms. We doctors have to observe all kinds of little things. Well, of course, I know it's only fancy, but it is just as bad as if it were real. I assure you it is making me quite ill. And I didn't like to mention it to Mr. Carson or to George. They would think I was losing my head. I gave Mrs. Carson the same prescription as I had written for Miss Stoner, though by that time the conviction had grown upon me that there was something wrong which could not be cured by medicine. However, I decided to say nothing to George about the matter at present, for I could hardly utilize the confidence which had been placed in me by Mrs. Stoner and Mr. Carson and Mrs. Carson, and my own experience of the night before would scarcely have appeared convincing to him. But I determined that on the next day, which was Sunday, I would invent an excuse for staying at home from church and make some explorations in the house. There was obviously some mystery at work, which wanted clearing up. We all sat up rather late that night. There seemed to be a general disinclination to go to bed. We stayed all together in the billiard room until nearly midnight, and then loitered about in the hall, talking in an aimless sort of fashion. But at last Mrs. Carson said good night, with a confidential nod to me, and Miss Stoner murmured, "So many thanks, I've got it." And they both went upstairs. George and I parted in the corridor above. Our rooms were opposite each other. I did not begin undressing at once, but sat down and tried to piece together some theory to account for the uncanniness of things. But the more I thought, the more perplexing it became. There was no doubt whatever that I had put my hand on something extremely alive and extremely unpleasant the night before. The bare recollection of it made me shudder. What living thing could possibly be creeping about the house in the dark? It was a man's hand. Of that I was certain from the size of it. George Carson was out of the question, for he was in his room the whole time. Nor was it likely that Mr. Carson, Sr., would steal about his own house in his socks and refuse to answer when spoken to. The only other man in the house was an eminently respectable-looking butler, and his hand, as I had noted particularly when he poured out my wine at dinner, was plump and soft, whereas the mysterious hand on the balustrade was thin and bony. And then, what was the real explanation of the face which had appeared to the two ladies? Indigestion might have explained either singly. Extraordinary coincidences do sometimes occur. But it seemed too extraordinary that a couple of ladies, one old and one young, should suffer from the same indigestion in the same house, at the same time, and with the same symptoms. On the whole, I did not feel at all comfortable, and looked carefully in all the cupboards and recesses, as well as under the bed, before starting to undress. Then I went to the door, intending to lock it. Just as my hand was upon the key, I heard a soft step in the corridor outside, accompanied by a sound which was something between a sigh and a groan. Very faint, but quite unmistakable, and, under the circumstances, discomposing. It might of course, be George. Anyhow, I decided to look and see, and I turned the handle gently and opened the door. There was nothing to be seen in the corridor, but on the opposite side I could see a door open, and George's head peeping round the corner. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I replied. "Was that you walking up the passage?" he asked. "No," I answered. "I thought it might be you." "Then who the devil was it?" he said. "I'll swear I heard someone." There was silence for a few moments. I was wondering whether I had better tell him of the fright I had already had, when he spoke again. "I say, just come here for a bit, old fellow. I want to speak to you." I stepped across the passage, and we went together into the little study which adjoined his bedroom. "Look here," he said, poking up the fire, which was burning low. "Doesn't it strike you that there is something very odd about this house?" "You mean—" "Well, I wouldn't say anything about it to the master or Miss Stoner for fear of frightening them. All the same, scarcely a night passes but I hear curious footsteps on the stairs. You've heard them yourself, haven't you?" "Now that you mention it," I said, "I confess I have. And what is more," he continued, "I was sitting here 2 nights ago half asleep, and, it seems ridiculous, I know, but it's a fact, I suddenly saw a horrible face glaring at me from between those curtains behind you. It was gone in a moment, but I saw it as plainly as I see you." I moved my seat uneasily. Did you look in the bedroom or in the passage?" I asked. "Yes, at once," he replied. "There was nothing to be seen, but twice again that night I heard footsteps passing. Good God!" He started up in his chair, staring straight over my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw the curtains which parted off the bedroom swing together. "What is it?" I asked breathlessly. I saw it again, the same face, between the curtains. I tore the hangings aside and rushed into the next room. It was empty. The lamp was burning upon a side table, and the door was open, just as George had left it. In the passage outside all was quiet. I came back into the study and found George running his fingers through his hair in perplexity. There is clearly one person too many in the house," I said. "I think we ought to draw the place and find out who it is." "All right," said he, picking up the poker from the fireplace. "If it's anything made of flesh and blood, this will be useful. And if not—" He stopped short. For at that instant the most awful shriek of horror rang through the house, a shriek of wild, uncontrollable terror, such as I had never heard before, and I never hope to hear again. One moment we stood staring at each other, dumbfounded. The next, George Carson had dashed out of the room and down the corridor of the stairs. I followed close behind him, for we both knew that none but a woman in mortal fear would shriek like that, and that woman was Miss Stoner. Down the stairs we tumbled pell-mell into the darkness, but before I reached the landing below, where Miss Stoner's room was, I felt, as I had felt the evening before, something brush swiftly past me. As I ran, I turned and caught it in the dark, but my hand gripped only empty air. I was just about to turn back and follow it when a cry from George arrested me and looking down, I saw him standing over the prostrate form of Miss Stoner. The door of her room was open, and by the moonlight which streamed into her room, I could see her lying in her white nightdress across the threshold. What followed in the next few minutes I can scarcely recall with accuracy. The whole house was aroused by the poor girl's awful shriek. She was quite unconscious when we came upon her, but she revived more or less as soon as Mrs. Carson and one of the terrified servants had lifted her into bed again. Nothing intelligible could be gathered from her, however, as to the cause of her fright. She only repeated hysterically again and again, "Oh, the face, the face." When I saw I could do her no further good for the present, I took George by the arm and led him out of the room. "Look here, George," I said. "We must find out the reason for this at once. I'm certain I felt something go by me as I came downstairs. Now, does that staircase lead anywhere but to our rooms?" George considered for a moment. "Yes," he replied. "There is a door at the end of the passage which leads up into a sort of lumber room." "Then we'll explore it," I said. "For my part, I can't go to sleep until I've got to the bottom of this. Get the man to bring a lantern along." The butler looked as though he didn't half like the enterprise, and, to tell the truth, no more did I. It was the uncanniest job I ever undertook. However, we started, the three of us. First of all, we searched the rooms on the floor above, where George and I slept. First of all, we searched the rooms on the floor above where George and I slept. Everything was just as we had left it. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. A crazy-looking staircase led up into the darkness. We went cautiously up. I first with a candle, then George, and last of all, the butler with a lantern. At the top, we stepped into a big, rather low room, with beams across the ceiling and a rough, uneven floor. Our lights threw strange shadows into the corners, and more than once I started at what looked like a crouching human figure. We searched every corner. There was nothing to be seen but a few old boxes, a roll or two of matting, and some broken chairs. But, in the far corner, George pointed out to me a rickety ladder, which ended at a closed trap-door. Just then I distinctly heard the curious, half-groaning, half-sighing sound which had already puzzled me in the corner below. We stood still and looked at one another. We all heard the sound. "Whatever it is, it's up there," I said. "The question is, who's going up?" George put his candle down upon the floor and stepped upon the ladder. It cracked beneath his weight. He stopped. "Come down. It won't bear you," I said. "I shall have to go." I don't know that I was ever in such queer funk as I was while I slowly mounted that ladder and pushed upon the trap-door. I had formed no clear idea of what I expected to find there. Certainly, I was not prepared for what happened. For no sooner was the trap-door fully open than there literally fell upon me, from the darkness above, a thing in human shape, which kicked and spat and tore at me as I stood clinging to the ladder. It lasted but a moment or so, but in that moment I lived a lifetime of terror. The ladder swayed and cracked beneath me, and I fell to the floor with the thing gripping my throat like a vice. The next instant, George had stunned it with a blow from the poker and dragged it off me. It lay upon its back on the floor, a ragged, hideous, loathsome shape, and the mystery was solved. "But you haven't told us what it really was," said one of the listeners. The doctor smiled. It was the owner of the house, he replied. He had not gone abroad. He had gone to a private lunatic asylum with homicidal mania upon him. About a fortnight before this, he had managed to escape and, having made his way to his former home, had concealed himself with a cunning often shown by lunatics in the loft. I suppose he had found enough to eat in his nightly rambles around the house. The only wonder is that he didn't kill someone before he was caught. That's the end of the story. Again, remember these are from the 1800s, so lunatics and, So, yeah, please don't go after me for this stuff. Do not turn me in to Facebook or anywhere else. This is just the way it's written. I'm going by, what's here. Next one is Colonel Halifax's ghost story. There's no author. I had just come back to England after having been some years in India, and was looking forward to meet my friends, among whom there was none I was more anxious to see than Sir Francis Linton. We had been to Eton together, and for the short time I had been at Oxford before entering the army, we had been in the same college. Then we had parted. He came into the title and estates of the family in Yorkshire on the death of his grandfather. His father had predeceased, and I had been over a good part of the world. One visit, indeed, I had made him in his Yorkshire home, before leaving for India, but a few days. It will be easily imagined how pleasant it was, 2 or 3 days after my arrival in London, to receive a letter from Linton saying that he had just seen in the papers that I had arrived, and begging me to come down at once to Byfield, his place in Yorkshire. "You're not to tell me," he said, "that you cannot come. In fact, you are to come on Monday. I have a couple of horses which will just suit you. The carriage shall meet you at the Packham, and all you have to do is to put yourself in the train which leaves King's Cross at 12 o'clock. Accordingly, on the day appointed, I started in due time, reached Packham, losing much time on the detestable branch line, and there found the dog-cart of Sir Francis awaiting me. I drove at once to Byfield. The house I remembered. It was a low gable structure with no great size, with old-fashioned lattice windows separated from the park. Separated from the park where we're dear, by a charming terrace garden. No sooner did the wheels crunch the gravel by the principal entrance, than, almost before the bell was rung, the porch door opened, and there stood Linton himself, whom I had not seen for so many years, hardly altered, and with all the joy of welcome beaming in his face. Taking me by both hands, he drew me into the house, got rid of my hat and wraps, looked me all over, and then, in a breath, began to say how glad he was to see me, what a real delight it was to have got me at last under his roof, and what a good time we would have together, like the old days all over again. He had sent my luggage up to my room, which was ready for me, and he bade me make haste and dress for dinner. So saying, he took me through a panelled hall, up an old oak-soaked staircase, and showed me my room, which, hurried as I was, I observed was hung with tapestry, and had a large four-poster bed, with velvet curtains opposite the window. They had gone into dinner when I came down, despite all the haste I made in dressing, but a place had been kept for me next to Lady Linton. Besides my hosts, there were their 2 daughters, Colonel Linton, a brother of Sir Francis, the chaplain, and some others whom I don't remember distinctly. After dinner, there was some music in the hall, and a game of whist in the drawing room, and after the ladies had gone upstairs, Linton and I retired to the smoking room, where we sat up talking the better part of the night. I think it must have been near 3 when I retired. Once in bed, I slept so soundly that my servant's entrance the next morning failed to arouse me, and it was past 9 when I awoke. After breakfast, and at the disposal of the newspapers, Linton retired to his letters, and I asked Lady Linton if one of her daughters might show me the house. Elizabeth, the eldest, was summoned, and seemed in no way to dislike the task. The house was, as already intimated, by no means large. It occupied 3 sides of a square, the entrance at one end and the stables making the fourth side. The interior was full of interest. Passages, rooms, galleries, as well as hall, were paneled in dark wood and hung with pictures. I was shown everything on the ground, losing much time on a detestable branch line. Okay. Okay, I see what happened. It skips around here, so I was shown everything on the ground floor and then on the first floor. Losing my time on a detestable branch line. I don't know where that there's a quote there that makes no sense. Then my guide proposed that we should ascend a narrow, twisting staircase that led to a gallery. We did as proposed and entered a handsome long room or passage leading to a small chamber at one end, in which my guide told me her father kept books and papers. I asked if anyone slept in this gallery, as I noticed a bed and fireplace, and rods by means of which curtains might be drawn. Enclosing one portion were the bed and fireplace, so as to convert it into a very cozy chamber. She answered no. The place was not really used except as a playroom, though sometimes, if the house happened to be very full, in her great-grandfather's time, she had heard that it had been occupied. By the time that we had been over the house, and I had also been shown the garden and the stables, introduced to the dogs, it was nearly 1 o'clock. We were to have an early luncheon and to drive afterwards to see the ruins of one of the grand old Yorkshire abbeys. This was a pleasant expedition, and we got back just in time for tea, after which there was some reading aloud. The evening passed much in the same way as the preceding one, except that Linton, who had some business, did not go down to the smoking room, and I took the opportunity of retiring early in order to write a letter for the Indian mail, something having been said as to the prospect of hunting the next day. I had finished my letter, which was a long one, together with 2 or 3 others, and had just gotten to bed when I heard a step overhead, as if someone was walking along the gallery, which I now knew ran immediately above my room. It was a slow, heavy, measured tread, which I could hear getting gradually louder and nearer, and then as gradually fading away as it retreated into the distance. I was startled for a moment, having been told that the gallery was unused, but the next instant it occurred to me that I had been told and communicated with a chamber where Sir Francis kept books and papers. I knew he had some writing to do, and I thought no more of the matter. I was down the next morning at breakfast in good time. "How late you were last night," I said to Linton in the middle of the breakfast. "I heard you overhead after 1 o'clock. Linton replied rather shortly, "Indeed you did not, for I was in bed last night before 12. "There was someone certainly moving overhead last night," I answered, "for I heard his steps as distinctly as I heard anything in my life going down the gallery." Upon which Colonel Linton remarked that he had often fancied he had heard steps on the staircase, when he knew that no one was about. He was apparently disposed to say more, when his brother interrupted him somewhat curtly, and I fancied, and asked me if I should feel inclined after breakfast to have a horse and go out and look for the hounds. They met a considerable way off, but if they did not find in the coverts they would first draw, a thing not improbable, they would come our way, and we might fall in with them about 1 o'clock and have a run. I said there was nothing I would like better. Linton mounted me on a very nice chestnut, and the rest of the party having gone out shooting, and the young ladies being otherwise engaged, he and I started about 11 o'clock for our ride. It was a beautiful day, soft, with a bright sun, one of those beautiful days which so frequently occur in the early part of November. On reaching the hilltop where Linton had expected to meet the hounds, no trace of them was to be discovered. They must have found at once and run in a different direction. At 3 o'clock, after we had eaten our sandwiches, Linton reluctantly abandoned all hopes of falling in with the hounds, and said we would return home by a slightly different route. We had not descended to the hill before we came on an old chalk quarry and the remains of a disused kiln. I recollected the spot at once. I had been here with Sir Francis on my former visit, many years ago. Why, bless me, said I. Do you remember, Linton, what happened here when I was with you before? There had been men engaged in removing chalk, and they came on a skeleton upon under some depth of rubble. We went together to see it removed, and you said you would have it preserved till it could be examined by some ethnologist or anthropologist, any one of those dry as dust, to decide whether the remains, I can't say the words, okay, were dolicephalus or brachycephalus, whether British or Danish or modern. What was the result? Sir Francis hesitated a moment and answered, "It is true. I had the remains removed. Was there an inquest?" "No. I had been opening some of the tumuli on the worlds. I had seen a crouched skeleton and some skulls. I had sent crouched. I'm losing my mind. I had sent a crouched skeleton and some skulls to the Scarsborough Museum. This I was doubtful about, whether it was a prehistoric interment. In fact, to what date it belonged. No one thought of an inquest. On reaching the house, one of the grooms who took the horses, in answer to a question from Linton, said that the Colonel and Mrs. Hampshire had arrived about an hour ago, and that one of the horses being lame, the carriage in which they had driven over from Castle Frampton was to be put up for the night. In the drawing room we found Lady Linton pouring out tea for her husband's sister and her husband, who, as we came in, exclaimed, "We have come to beg a night's lodging." It appeared that they had been on a visit in the neighborhood, and had been obliged to leave at a moment's notice in consequence of a sudden death in the house where they were staying, and that, in the impossibility of getting a fly, their host had sent them over to Byfield. Let me double check something really quick. I'm going to lean forward, because I want to see something here. Let me see if I can come down with it. Okay. Like I said, I want to be on like an hour here, so I'm just watching the time. Okay, we thought, Mrs. Hampshire went on to say, that as we were coming here, at the end of the next week, you would not mind having us a little sooner, or that, if the house were quite full, you would be willing to put us up, anywhere till Monday, and let us come back later. Lady Linton interposed with the remark that it was all settled, and then, turning to her husband, added, "But I want to speak to you for a moment." They both left the room together. Linton came back almost immediately, and, making an excuse to show me, on a map in the hall, the point to which we had ridden, said, as soon as we were alone, with a look of considerable annoyance, "I'm afraid we must ask you to change your room. Shall you mind very much? I think we can make you quite comfortable upstairs in the gallery, which is the only room available. Lady Linton has had a good fire lit. The place is really not cold, and it will be only for a night or two. Your servant has been told to put your things together, but Lady Linton did not like to give orders to have them actually moved before my speaking to you. I assured him that I did not mind in the very least, that I should be quite comfortable upstairs, but that I did mind very much their making such a fuss about a matter of that sort with an old friend like myself. Certainly nothing could look more comfortable than my new lodging when I went upstairs to dress. There was a bright fire in the large grate. An armchair had been drawn up beside it, and all my books and writing things had been put in, with a reading lamp in the central position, and the heavy tapestry curtains were drawn, converting this part of the gallery into a room to itself. Indeed, I felt somewhat inclined to congratulate myself on the change. The spiral staircase had been one reason against this place having been given to the Hampshires. No lady's long dress trunk could have mounted it. Sir Francis was necessarily a good deal occupied. Sir Francis was necessarily a good deal occupied in the evening with his sister and her husband, whom he had not seen for some time. Colonel Hampshire had also just heard that he was likely to be ordered to Egypt, and when Linton and he retired to the smoking room, instead of going there, I went upstairs to my own room to finish a book in which I was interested. I did not, however, sit up long, and very soon went to sleep. Before doing so, I drew back the curtains on the rods, partly because I like plenty of air where I sleep, and partly also because I thought I might like to see the play of the moonlight on the floor of the portion of the gallery beyond where I lay, and where the blinds had not been drawn. I must have been asleep some time, for the fire, which I had left in full blaze, was gone to a few sparks wandering among the ashes, when I suddenly awoke with the impression of having heard a latch click at the further extremity of the gallery, where was the chamber containing books and papers. I had also been a light sleeper, but on the present occasion I woke at once to complete and acute consciousness, and with a sense of stretched attention, which seemed to intensify all my faculties. The wind had risen, and was blowing in fitful gusts round the house. A minute or two passed, and I began almost to fancy I must have been mistaken, when I distinctly heard the creak of the door, and then the click of the latch falling back into place. Then I heard a sound on the boards, as of one moving in the gallery. I sat up to listen, and as I did so, I distinctly heard steps coming down the gallery. "Who are you?" I heard them approach and pass my bed. I could see nothing. All was dark. But I heard the tread proceeding toward where there were uncurtained and unshuttered windows, 2 in number. But the moon shone through only one of these, the nearest. The other was dark, shadowed by the chapel or some other building at the right angles. The tread seemed to me to pause now and again, and then continue as before. I now fixed my eyes intently on the one illuminated window, and it appeared to me as if some dark body passed across it. But what? I listened intently, and heard the step proceed to the end of the gallery, and then return. I again watched the lighted window, and immediately that sound reached the portion, and the long passages ceased momentarily. It ceased momentarily, and I saw, as distinctly as I ever saw anything in my life by moonlight, a figure of a man with marked features and what appeared to be a fur cap drawn over his brows. It stood in the embrace of the window, and the outline of the face was in silhouette. Then it moved on, and as it moved I again heard the tread. I was as certain as I could be that the thing, whatever it was, or the person, whoever he was approaching my bed. I threw myself back in the bed, and as I did see a mass of charred wood on the hearth fall down and set up a flash of, I fancy, sparks, that gave out a glare in the darkness, and by that, red as blood, I saw a face near me. With a cry over which I had as little control as the scream uttered by a sleeper in the agony of a nightmare, I called, "Who are you?" There was an instant during which my hair bristled on my head, and in the horror of the darkness I prepared to grapple with the being at my side, when a board creaked as if someone had moved, and I heard the footsteps retreat, and again the click of the latch. The next instant there was a rush on the stairs, and Linton burst into the room just as he had sprung out of bed, crying, "For God's sake, what's the matter? Are you ill?" I could not answer. Linton struck a light and leaned over the bed. Then I seized him by the arm and said, without moving, "There has been something in this room, gone and thither." I hate to do this, but we're going to have to stop right here, and we will continue next week. I apologize. We're running, behind on it, so we will continue next week. I want to thank you guys for coming. Tomorrow, don't forget, we are going to have Flat Earth Dave is going to join us. We're going to be talking about Flat Earth Theory, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. I will see you tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day.